Chapter 5 Filipinos. Filipinos fit everywhere and nowhere at all. We are the invisible of the invisibles, a staggering feat considering that the worldwide Filipino population stands at 115 million. About 105 million live in the Philippine Islands, making the Philippines the world's 12th most populous country just below Mexico. And an additional 10 million are scattered across 100 countries, most whom are permanent legal residents or citizens of one of those countries. Of the 10 million overseas Filipinos, more than 3.5 million live in the US, making us the second largest Asian group in the US. Even though 1 out of 5 Asian Americans is Filipino, many of us don't identify as Asian. Our Filipino towns aren't as visible as Koreatown and Chinatown. Wherever we are and however we self-identify, non-Filipinos have an interesting way of identifying us. Even though our jobs are as varied as our people, we're nurses and lawyers, artists and professors, most people I meet seem to think of us as servants. Apparently, we are among the most sought-after group of domestic workers. I've lost count of how many times someone told me, apropos of nothing, "You guys make the best nannies and maids." Perhaps that's because Filipino culture, while proud of its singularity and eccentricity, is so malleable. Adaptability was essential for surviving 420 years of emotional and physical ravages. A colonial history in brief. The Philippines Islands were discovered by Spanish colonialists who ruled them more than 370 years until the Americans, desperate to expand their economic and political reach, craved empire. The United States declared itself the rightful owner of the islands for some 50 years. In his book, In Our Image, America's Empire in the Philippines, historian Stanley Carnow characterized my birth country's colonial history as being 300 years in the convent, 50 years in Hollywood. My grandparents embodied this unshakable, colonial-inspired reality. Both devout Catholics, the Philippines is the only predominantly Catholic country in Asia. Lolo learned English words and phrases by listening to Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin in jukeboxes, while Lola preferred Nat King Cole and Ella Fitzgerald. Some of my Filipino-American friends joke that the Americans only remember Filipinos when they need us to house their naval fleet and fight their battles. Consider the fate of Filipino soldiers who fought the Japanese during World War II. With the promise of U.S. citizenship and full veteran benefits, more than 250,000 Filipino soldiers fought under the American flag, playing a crucial role in achieving victory. Shortly after, the Rescission Act of 1946 retroactively took away these soldiers' status as U.S. veterans. The message was clear: your service didn't matter. It took more than 60 years to rectify the injustice. From the outset, this codependent and abusive relationship has been complicated by race and skin color. During the Philippine-American War, white American soldiers in the Philippines referred to Filipinos as Ents because of their dark complexion. When Filipinos first arrived in California in the early to mid-1900s, confused Americans placed them in the same ethnic category as Mongolians. In California, local authorities imposed anti-miscegenation laws on Filipinos, and Filipinos had to drive out of state in order to marry white women. Throughout the Great Depression, white Americans claimed that Filipinos brought down the standard of living because they worked for low wages. Many hotels, restaurants, and even swimming pools displayed signs that read, "Positively no Filipinos allowed." Still, if the Philippines was America's first real temptation, as Mark Twain wrote, then America, given its imperialist history, also became a temptation for the Filipinos eager to escape poverty and provide for their families. After all, if Americans could come and claim the Philippines, why can't Filipinos move to America? Colorism cuts deep in any colonized country, and I was born to parents who were considered the mestizos, light-skinned ones, in their own families. I'm the only child of Emily Salinas and Jose Lito Vargas. Shortly after they got married, it became apparent that they had been too young to wed, much less have a child. From the start, their marriage was subsidized by their parents. My father was one of 9 children. His mother, Dolores, was the second wife of Raymond, a businessman in the capital city of Manila. I don't remember ever meeting Raymond. My mother was the only daughter of Teofilo and Leonila, a lower middle-class couple in Iba, a rural barangay town in Zambales, an agricultural province dotted with unlimited rice farms and the sweetest heart-shaped mangoes you'll ever taste. To this day, when I see mangoes at grocery stores, I am reminded of Iba. All over Zambales were beautiful rivers with crystalline waters where we bathed and washed our laundry. Teofilo was a high school dropout. Leonila did not make it past 6th grade. My parents separated before I learned to speak, and if family lore is to be believed, the first words I ever spoke were Lolo and Lola. As the first Apo, grandchild of Teofilo and Leonilla, I was treated as if I were their own child. If you lived in Zambales at the time, there were three primary ways to get to America. 1. Join the U.S. Navy. 2. Marry a U.S. citizen. 3. Get petitioned by a relative. Lolo's younger sister, Flory, fell in love with an American who served in the U.S. Marines. They married, and Flory headed to America in 1963, becoming a U.S. citizen by 1966. When Flory asked Lolo if he wanted to come to America and bring his family, Lolo did not hesitate. Across the developing country, which was mired in political corruption, people believed that going to America was the golden ticket to better jobs, better wages, a better life. Because of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which ended decades-long racial and ethnic quotas and favored family unification, Flory was able to file a petition to bring Lolo into the United States. The wait took more than a decade. In 1984, when I was 3 years old, Lolo and Lola left Zambales for California. The only thing I've ever gotten from my father were his name and his thick eyebrows. By the time Lolo and Lola left, Papa had abandoned Mama and me. For as long as I can remember, Mama and his parents cared for me. Since she was the daughter in the family who was expected to marry and have kids, Lolo told Mama to drop out of school so her younger brother could go to college. Lolo could only afford to send one kid to school. Mama left me in the care of relatives as she looked for odd jobs, which were hard to find for a woman with no college degree. After a while, Lolo and Lola told Mama to stop trying to find work and focus on raising me. They began supporting us. The Philippines is one of the world's largest recipients of remittances. Lolo and Lola were among the estimated 3.5 million Filipinos in the U.S. who would send monthly remittances that the Philippine economy could not survive without, creating a culture of consumerism and a cycle of financial dependency that I was part of before I even knew who I was. As a toddler in Iba, before Lolo and Lola emigrated to America, I grew up in a house made of cement and wood with a makeshift bathroom. Running water was precious in the provinces, and we cleaned ourselves, including bathing, using the tabo system. Tabo are vessels used to make water from a timba. That way, water is not wasted. Before the Americans took over, coconut shells served as tabo. Americans introduced Filipinos to plastic, and plastic tabo were born. Once Lolo and Lola moved to the U.S., Mama and I moved to Pasig, in the capital city, living in a rented apartment with running water, paid for, of course, by Lolo and Lola. Growing up in Pasig, I thought of Lolo and Lola as wealthy people who had unlimited American dollars and an endless supply of M&M's candy and cans of Spam, which they regularly shipped to us in Balikbayan repatriate box. It was not until I arrived in California to live with them that I discovered that they were not rich. In fact, they barely survived, working low-paying jobs. She as a food server, he as a security guard. To this day, I don't know how they managed to stretch every earned dollar. They didn't own a sprawling home, as I had imagined, but rented a modest 3-bedroom house from Lolo's sister Flory. One of the bedrooms was for Lolo and Lola, one bedroom I shared with Uncle Roland, my mother's youngest brother, and the third bedroom they rented out to a friend. Lolo usually worked the overnight shift, while Lola and Uncle Roland worked during the day. After school, I was in charge of raking the leaves from the lawn, taking out the trash, and making sure the dishes were always washed. If I'd been an obedient son in Pasig, I was an even more obedient grandson in Mountain View. In my mind, it was all I could do to support Lolo and Lola as they struggled to make ends meet, paying all their monthly bills while continuing to support Mama with a monthly allowance. Uncle Roland, who worked in accounting, paid for whatever expenses I needed at school. At this point, Mama had a steady boyfriend named Jimmy, who worked overseas from time to time. Their daughter, Zarina, my half-sister, was barely 2 years old when I left. 2 years after I came to America, they had a son, Carl, my half-brother, whom I have yet to meet in person. Jimmy helped raise them and continues to provide support. Even though Lolo and Lola arrived in the U.S. nearly a decade before I did, I was their introduction to America, which is typical in intergenerational immigrant families, trying to find their footing in their adopted homes. Our home was decidedly Filipino. Lola could tell you the news from Manila, but would struggle to explain what was happening in San Francisco, just an hour north of us. We spoke either Tagalog or Sambali, the dialect spoken by the people of the Zambales. We ate only Filipino food, mostly rice, fish, and pork. We mostly interacted with Filipino friends and relatives. We used the tabo system even though we had running water. Google was founded less than 2 miles from our house, which is not far from Stanford University. Mountain View is near the geographic heart of Silicon Valley. the storied region in the San Francisco Bay Area that runs on engineers and entrepreneurs placing their bets as they search for the next new thing. I grew up in the poorer part of Mountain View in the 1990s, before Apple, in nearby Cupertino, was dubbed the most valuable brand in the world, and before Facebook, in nearby Menlo Park, would revolutionize the social media era. These days, renting an apartment can cost upward of $3,000 a month, and you'd be hard-pressed to buy a home for less than $1 million. On any given day, at any given time, you'll spot a few Teslas on the road. But my family is from the other Mountain View, which is part of the other Silicon Valley. This is the Mountain View of immigrant families who lived in cramped houses and apartments, who depended on Univision, Saigon TV News, and the Filipino channel for news at home, not the homes they're living in, but the homes they left behind. This is the Silicon Valley of ethnic grocery stores and nondescript and dilapidated buildings, where sacks of rice and pounds of pork are cheaper, where you hear some Spanish, Tagalog, and Vietnamese before you hear a word of English. This is the other Mountain View in the other Silicon Valley, where the American dream rests on the outdated and Byzantine immigration system that requires families to wait for years, if not decades, to be reunited with their loved ones. Where I grew up, Filipinos who populated public schools struggled to figure out where we belonged in an America that sees itself as mostly black and white. If America is a wobbly three-legged stool, with white Americans and black Americans each taking a leg, the third leg is divided between Latinos and Asians, whose histories of struggle and oppression are often maligned and neglected. I'm not sure which leg Native Americans would stand on. As for the Filipinos, we are stuck in the middle of one leg of that wobbly stool.